Some people don't come into your life to love you. They come to control you. My name is Elena Carter. I was 29 years old when I finally understood that some people do not break you all at once. They do it slowly and carefully until you no longer recognize the person staring back at you in the mirror. And by the time you realize what has happened, you were already carrying pieces of pain that feel impossible to remove because they have become part of your daily life, part of your breathing, part of the way you think about yourself every single morning when you wake up and wonder whether you were always this empty or whether somebody slowly carved the light out of you without you noticing. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood in Portland where every house looked warm from the outside, even though some of them were full of people who only knew how to love through pressure, criticism, and control. And my family was exactly like that because my mother believed perfection was the only thing that made someone valuable, while my father believed emotions were weakness. So our home always looked peaceful to strangers, even when it felt emotionally cold enough to make you feel lonely while sitting at the same dinner table with people who shared your blood. My older brother Nathan was the favorite child, without anyone needing to say it directly, because everything in the house revolved around his achievements, his future, his mistakes being forgiven while mine were remembered for years. And every time I tried to express myself, my mother would compare me to him in that calm, disappointing voice that somehow hurt more than shouting ever could, because she knew exactly how to make me feel small without raising her tone even once. When I was 14, I won a regional writing competition at school, and I remember coming home with the certificate shaking in my hands because for one brief moment, I truly believed my parents would finally look at me with pride instead of disappointment. But my father barely glanced at the paper before asking why my grades in mathematics were still lower than Nathan's. And that night, I locked myself in the bathroom, staring at my reflection while trying not to cry loudly enough for anyone to hear, because in our house, sadness was treated like weakness, and weakness was something people punished instead of comforted. As the years passed, I became the kind of person who apologized too much, stayed quiet too often, and accepted things that should have hurt me because I had been trained to believe that love always had conditions attached to it. So when I moved to Seattle at 26 for a marketing job, I carried all those emotional wounds with me without realizing how dangerous they were, because broken people often attract those who know exactly how to use their loneliness against them. That was where I met Daniel Hayes during a company networking event on a rainy November evening inside a crowded rooftop lounge overlooking the city lights. And from the very first conversation, he made me feel seen in a way nobody else ever had, because he listened carefully when I spoke, remembered tiny details about my life, sent thoughtful messages every morning, and looked at me as though I was someone important instead of someone constantly failing to meet expectations. And for a woman who had spent most of her life starving emotionally, that kind of attention felt dangerously close to love. At first, everything about him felt safe and exciting at the same time, because he knew exactly how to make ordinary moments feel meaningful, whether it was driving across the city at midnight just because I mentioned craving coffee from a tiny cafe near Harbor Street, or standing outside my apartment in the freezing rain holding flowers after one difficult day at work while telling me nobody had the right to make me feel unimportant ever again. And little by little, I started depending on him emotionally in ways I did not fully understand, because he became the first person I called when I was happy, anxious, stressed, or afraid. But slowly, small things began changing in ways that were easy to ignore at first, because manipulation rarely arrives looking dangerous. Instead, it arrives disguised as concern, affection, and protection. So when he questioned why I stayed late at work with coworkers or why certain male friends still followed me online, I convinced myself it was because he cared deeply. And when he became cold every time I wanted space, I told myself relationships required compromise, even though deep inside, something already felt wrong. Around the same time, my family discovered I was dating him, and instead of asking whether I was happy, my mother immediately started criticizing every decision I made, while my father warned me that women who become emotionally distracted ruin their futures. And suddenly, I felt trapped between a relationship that controlled me through emotional dependence and a family that controlled me through shame, leaving me exhausted from trying to survive two different worlds that constantly made me feel guilty for simply existing. Then, one winter night, everything changed during what should have been an ordinary evening, because Daniel had fallen asleep on my couch after drinking too much wine, while his phone kept vibrating on the table beside me. And I normally never touched his phone because I wanted to believe trust still existed somewhere in my life. But something inside me felt uneasy enough to look, and the moment I unlocked the screen, I felt my entire body go cold, because the messages were not just from one woman, but several, all filled with the same promises, the same affectionate words, the same manipulative charm he once used on me, and buried between them was one sentence sent to a friend only an hour earlier that destroyed something inside me completely. She still thinks I'm the best thing that ever happened to her. I kept staring at those words while my hands trembled uncontrollably, because in that moment, every memory suddenly looked different, every romantic gesture felt fake, every vulnerable confession I had shared with him felt weaponized against me. And when he eventually woke up and realized I had seen the messages, he did not panic or apologize the way guilty people usually do. Instead, he looked at me with a calm expression that frightened me more than anger ever could, before saying something I would never forget for the rest of my life. "You needed someone to save you, Elena, and I needed someone easy to control." That sentence did not just break my heart, it broke the version of me that still believed love alone could heal a lifetime of emotional wounds. The night after Daniel confessed the truth about who he really was, I did not scream, throw things, or create the kind of dramatic scene people imagine when betrayal finally reveals itself, because the pain was too deep for anger at that point, and all I remember is sitting inside my apartment long after he left, while the city lights outside my window blurred together through tears I could no longer control. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise, I realized the most terrifying part was not that he lied to me for almost 2 years, but that I had trusted him enough to build my entire emotional world around someone who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity instead of something precious to protect. For 3 days, I ignored everyone, including my coworkers, my family, and the endless messages Daniel kept sending, as though he could somehow erase the damage simply by pretending nothing had happened. But eventually, reality forced its way back into my life, because rent still had to be paid, work still expected me to function normally, and people around me continued living their lives, while mine felt like it had quietly collapsed behind closed doors without anyone truly noticing. At the office, things became unbearable almost immediately because Daniel worked in the same company even though he was in a different department, and every hallway suddenly felt dangerous because I never knew when I would see him again or whether he would act guilty, manipulative, charming, or completely indifferent depending on which version of himself benefited him most in that moment. And the worst part was realizing how good he was at pretending, because around everyone else, he remained the same confident, intelligent man they all admired, while I walked through each day feeling like someone carrying a secret poison inside her chest. That was when another person unexpectedly entered my life. Her name was Camille Laurent, a 34-year-old project manager from Montreal who had recently transferred to our Seattle office, and unlike everyone else around me, she had the unsettling habit of noticing things people tried hard to hide. So one afternoon, after a disastrous meeting where I completely lost focus halfway through a presentation, she quietly followed me to the break room, handed me a coffee without asking questions, and simply said, "You look like someone surviving a war nobody else can see." Something about that sentence shattered the emotional wall I had been holding together for days, because it was the first time someone described exactly how I felt without minimizing it. And even though I barely knew her, I ended up sitting with her for almost 2 hours after work, telling her pieces of the truth I had not admitted out loud to anyone else, including the cheating, the manipulation, the emotional control, and the constant feeling that I no longer recognized myself anymore. Camille listened without interrupting, without forcing fake positivity onto me, and when I finally finished speaking, she leaned back in her chair and said something that stayed with me for months afterward. "Toxic people don't choose confident, happy targets first," she said calmly. "They choose people who already feel emotionally starved, because those are the easiest people to convince that control is love." I hated how accurate those words felt. Around the same time, my relationship with my family became even worse because my mother somehow turned my heartbreak into proof that every decision I made was wrong, and instead of comforting me, she repeatedly reminded me that she warned me about becoming too emotional, while my father responded with cold silence that filled the house like smoke every time I visited Portland for family dinners. And one evening, things exploded after my Aunt Rebecca casually mentioned hearing rumors about Daniel from mutual acquaintances. "You embarrassed yourself for a man like that?" my mother asked sharply in front of everyone. The room went silent instantly. For years, I would have apologized automatically just to avoid conflict, but something inside me finally snapped because humiliation piled on top of heartbreak becomes dangerous after a certain point. So for the first time in my life, I looked directly at my mother across that dining table and said, "You care more about appearances than whether your daughter is suffering." Nobody spoke after that. Not my father, not my brother, not even my mother. But the silence that followed felt different from the silence I grew up fearing, because for the first time, I was no longer shrinking to make other people comfortable. Unfortunately, standing up for myself did not magically heal anything, because trauma does not disappear simply because you finally recognize it. And over the following weeks, my mental state became worse in ways I could no longer hide, since I stopped sleeping properly, stopped eating regularly, made careless mistakes at work, and spent entire nights replaying conversations inside my head, wondering how many warning signs I ignored simply because I was desperate to feel loved. Then another complication appeared. One evening, while leaving work, I noticed a woman standing near the parking garage staring at me uncertainly before slowly approaching, and she introduced herself as Olivia Bennett, a graduate student from Vancouver whose face immediately looked familiar because I had already seen her pictures inside Daniel's messages that night. At first, I almost walked away because I thought she came to defend him, but instead, she looked nervous enough to shake while explaining that Daniel had been dating her the same time he dated me, and that she only recently discovered the truth herself after finding messages involving several other women. And as we sat inside a nearby diner talking for hours, I slowly realized the horrifying pattern neither of us had fully understood before, because Daniel repeated the exact same cycle with each woman, the same intense affection, the same emotional dependency, the same isolation tactics, and the same manipulative promises designed to make each person feel uniquely chosen before eventually destroying their self-worth piece by piece. "He studies people," Olivia whispered one moment while staring into her untouched tea. "He figures out what they're missing emotionally and becomes that thing until they depend on him." That sentence made my stomach turn, because deep down I knew it was true. Over the next month, Olivia and I stayed in contact unexpectedly often because shared trauma creates strange connections between strangers, and through her I learned there were more women than either of us originally realized, including a nurse named Hannah from Chicago who financially supported Daniel for almost a year, believing they were planning a future together, and another woman named Sophia who left her fiancé because Daniel convinced her they were soulmates, only to disappear emotionally once he grew bored of the relationship. The deeper we looked, the uglier the truth became. Yet, despite all of this, I still struggled emotionally in ways that frustrated me, because logic and emotional attachment rarely disappear at the same speed. So even after learning everything, there were nights I still missed him terribly, nights when loneliness made me want to answer his messages just to hear someone say my name again with affection. And those moments terrified me because they forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about myself. Part of me was still addicted to the emotional highs he created, even after recognizing how destructive they were. Meanwhile, my professional life continued falling apart. My manager, Richard Coleman, initially tried to be understanding after noticing my performance decline, but eventually the mistakes became impossible to ignore after I accidentally lost an important client proposal due to carelessness during a major campaign launch. And one rainy Thursday morning, he called me into his office with an expression that already told me exactly what was about to happen before he even opened his mouth. "Elena, I know you're going through something difficult, but this situation is affecting the entire team now." I already knew. The exhaustion in his eyes made that obvious. By the end of the conversation, I walked out unemployed, carrying a cardboard box full of meaningless office items while heavy rain poured across downtown Seattle. And I remember standing alone outside the building, feeling completely disconnected from reality, because losing Daniel hurt, losing my family's emotional support hurt, but losing my career too made me feel like my entire identity had collapsed all at once. That evening, Daniel called repeatedly for almost 2 hours. I ignored every attempt until finally a voicemail appeared. "Elena, please stop acting like I ruined your life," he said calmly. "You're choosing this reaction." I replayed the message 3 times in disbelief, because only someone truly emotionally broken inside could destroy people while convincing himself they caused their own suffering. And for the first time, my sadness slowly began transforming into something colder and more dangerous. Not revenge, clarity. Because once you finally see someone exactly as they are, the illusion can never fully return again, no matter how badly your heart misses the fantasy you once believed in. That night, I sat alone inside my dark apartment while thunder echoed outside the windows, and realized something terrifying but strangely liberating at the same time. Nobody was coming to save me. Not my family, not Daniel, not anyone. And somewhere deep inside that realization, another version of me quietly began waking up. After losing my job, my relationship, and whatever illusion of family security I still carried inside me, life became strangely quiet in a way that initially felt unbearable, Because when chaos disappears, you are finally left alone with your own thoughts, and mine were filled with questions I had avoided for years. Questions about why I accepted emotional crumbs from people who should have loved me fully, why I stayed silent whenever someone crossed my boundaries, and why I spent most of my life trying to earn affection from people who only valued me when I made myself smaller for their comfort. For almost 2 weeks, I barely left my apartment except to buy groceries or walk aimlessly through the city at night when the streets were empty enough to match how disconnected I felt inside. And during those walks, I started noticing things I had ignored for years. Because pain changes the way people observe the world. So suddenly, I noticed exhausted strangers sitting alone inside late-night cafes, pretending not to cry while staring at their phones. Couples arguing quietly at crosswalks while trying to appear normal in public. Old men feeding pigeons alone in parks, with expressions that looked permanently tired. And for the first time, I understood something uncomfortable but deeply human. Almost everyone was carrying invisible pain while pretending to function normally. One evening, Camille invited me to a small gathering at her apartment where several of her friends from work were celebrating her recent promotion. And initially, I almost refused because I no longer trusted myself around people after everything that happened. But something inside me was exhausted from isolation, so I forced myself to go, even though anxiety followed me the entire train ride there. That night changed more than I expected, not because something dramatic happened, but because for the first time in years, I spent several hours around people who did not demand anything from me emotionally. And among them was a quiet architect named Julian Mercer, who barely spoke at first, yet somehow made everyone around him feel heard without needing to dominate conversations. And unlike Daniel, he did not shower me with attention or try to study my weaknesses immediately. Instead, he simply treated me like a normal person, without trying to rescue me, impress me, or emotionally consume me. At one point during the evening, I accidentally spilled wine on my sleeve and immediately apologized out of habit, even though nobody cared. And Julian looked at me with slight confusion before calmly saying, "You apologize like someone expecting punishment." That sentence stayed in my mind long after the party ended. Over the following months, my life did not magically transform into happiness because healing is nowhere near as beautiful or inspiring as people pretend online, since most of it actually looks repetitive, lonely, and painfully slow. But little by little, I started rebuilding myself through small, consistent actions that nobody else would have noticed, because real change rarely arrives through dramatic moments. It arrives quietly through routines repeated every day until they eventually become part of who you are. I found temporary freelance work helping small businesses with digital marketing campaigns, started attending therapy sessions after years of believing emotional pain should simply be endured silently, began exercising regularly, not because I hated my body, but because I finally understood my body deserved care after surviving so much stress. And slowly, my apartment transformed too, because I stopped treating it like a place to emotionally decay and started treating it like somewhere I actually deserved to feel safe inside. At the same time, my relationship with my family reached a turning point none of us expected. One weekend, my father suffered a mild heart attack while working in the garage alone, and although he survived, seeing him fragile for the first time completely altered the emotional balance inside our family. Because suddenly, the man who spent decades acting emotionally untouchable looked frightened and exhausted in a hospital bed, while machines monitored his heartbeat. And during one quiet evening visit, he unexpectedly asked me to stay after everyone else left. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then finally, he said something I never imagined hearing from him. "I know I made this house difficult for you." The sentence sounded awkward coming from him, almost painful, as though emotional honesty was a language he never properly learned to speak. And while it was nowhere near a perfect apology, it still mattered because for the first time I saw my father not as an unshakable authority figure, but another damaged person repeating emotional patterns he himself probably inherited long before I was born. A few weeks later, my mother and I argued again during dinner after she criticized my freelance work compared to Nathan's successful corporate career. But instead of collapsing emotionally like I once would have, I calmly placed my fork down and looked directly at her before saying something that permanently changed our relationship. "You spent my entire life teaching me that love had to be earned," I told her quietly. "That's why I kept choosing people who made me suffer for affection." She tried interrupting immediately, but I continued speaking anyway, because after years of silence, my voice no longer felt afraid inside my own body. "I'm not blaming you for every mistake I made," I continued, "but I'm finally done begging to feel worthy around people who only notice me when I fail." My mother said nothing after that. For the first time in my life, she looked genuinely shaken. Not angry, not defensive, just confronted by a truth she could no longer avoid. Things between us did not become perfect overnight, but slowly the dynamic changed because I stopped participating in the emotional role assigned to me since childhood. And once people realize they can no longer control you through guilt, shame, or fear, they are forced to either respect your boundaries or lose access to you completely. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued unraveling in ways that almost felt unreal. Olivia occasionally updated me about him through mutual connections, and apparently several women eventually confronted him publicly after discovering overlapping lies involving money, manipulation, and emotional abuse, causing his carefully constructed image to collapse within social and professional circles that once admired him. And one afternoon, nearly a year after our breakup, I unexpectedly saw him again while leaving a bookstore downtown. But this time, everything felt different immediately. He no longer carried the same effortless confidence I remembered, because there was visible exhaustion in his posture now, the kind people develop when their charm finally stops protecting them from consequences. And when he noticed me, his expression shifted somewhere between surprise and regret before he slowly approached. "Elena," he said softly. I looked at him calmly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke because suddenly there was nothing left to perform anymore. No fantasy, no emotional games, no desperate need for validation between us. "I heard you're doing well," he eventually said. "I'm doing honestly," I replied. That answer seemed to affect him more than anger would have, since manipulative people understand conflict better than emotional detachment, since detachment means they no longer control the emotional atmosphere around you. He glanced downward briefly before speaking again. "I know saying sorry probably means nothing now." And strangely enough, he was right. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because I no longer needed his apology to rebuild my self-worth. For a moment, I studied his face carefully and realized something important. He looked lonely, not dramatically broken, not evil, just deeply empty in a way that suddenly made complete sense. Because people who spend their lives manipulating others usually destroy themselves eventually too, since no relationship built on control can ever create genuine connection. "I used to think ruining you would make me feel powerful," I admitted quietly, "but honestly, I just feel sad for you now." His eyes lowered again, and in that exact moment, I understood something that finally freed me completely. I had already won long ago, not because he suffered, not because karma punished him, not because I became colder or stronger than everyone else. I won because I survived becoming someone I no longer recognized and still found my way back to myself anyway. That night, after leaving the bookstore, I walked for hours through Seattle while cold autumn wind moved between the buildings, and for the first time in years, my mind felt truly calm instead of emotionally guarded. And when I eventually returned home, I noticed something unexpected waiting outside my apartment door. A small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from my mother. Not long, not perfect, but real. She wrote about growing up with emotionally distant parents herself, about confusing criticism with preparation, because she believed harshness made people stronger. And near the end of the letter, there was one sentence stained slightly by what looked like tears. "I loved you, Elena. I just did not know how to love gently." I sat on my kitchen floor reading those words over and over as emotions I'd buried for years slowly surfaced again. And although the pain of my childhood did not disappear instantly, something inside me softened because understanding someone's damage doesn't excuse the harm they caused, but sometimes it helps you stop carrying hatred that was poisoning you long after the original wound happened. Months later, life became quieter, steadier, more honest. I continued therapy, expanded my freelance business into a small consulting agency, rebuilt healthier friendships, and slowly allowed myself to trust certain people again, including Julian, who remained patient enough never to force emotional intimacy before I was ready. And one snowy evening, while we walked near the waterfront, he gently took my hand for the first time after months of friendship and said something simple that nearly made me cry. "You don't have to earn safety around me. No manipulation, no intensity, no emotional performance, just calm sincerity." And suddenly I realized healthy love does not feel like drowning, confusion, obsession, or fear of abandonment. Healthy love feels peaceful. A year after everything collapsed, I stood once again in front of my apartment mirror, the same place where I once stared at myself feeling completely destroyed. And this time I saw something different because I no longer saw a victim trying desperately to be chosen by others. I saw a woman who finally chose herself first. Not selfishly, not cruelly, just wisely. I touched the reflection lightly and smiled for the first time in what felt like forever, because now I understood something that once would have sounded impossible to me. The worst heartbreak of my life did not destroy me permanently. It forced me to become someone honest, someone aware, someone capable of protecting her own peace without losing her ability to love completely. And maybe that was the real victory all along.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss any new videos, and share this content with your friends to support us and help us grow.